Your property is in violation. You have 14 days to comply, or we take action." She said it the way people say things rehearsed in front of a mirror, clean, clipped, with the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who knew the law. She was standing at the edge of my gravel drive in a blazer the color of slate, holding a clipboard with a laminated sheet on top, and the morning light was catching the silver clasp in a way that made the whole tableau look almost official. Almost. I took the notice from her hand, read the first 2 lines, and said nothing. The road behind her, the one she had driven in on, the one she would need to drive out on, ran straight through a strip of land I had owned for 31 years. The road itself was mine. The culvert under it was mine. The drainage ditch alongside it was mine. She did not know any of that. She thought she was standing on HOA-administered easement territory, delivering a compliance notice to a difficult property owner who would either fold or argue. She was doing neither of those things. She was standing on my land, handing me a piece of paper about my land, and I was watching her with the same quiet attention I gave to everything I did not yet need to act on. Drop a comment, tell me where you're from, and if something like this has ever happened to you, I want to hear it. The land had been in my family since 1961. My grandfather, Earl Crandall, bought the original parcel, 84 acres of creek bottom and ridge timber in the hill country of central Tennessee, for $11,000, and a handshake later formalized into a deed recorded with Harlan County on the 14th of March of that year. He was a civil engineer by training and a farmer by disposition, and he understood, in the way that men of his generation understood things, that land was not an investment. It was a covenant. He built the first structure on the property himself, a low timber frame house set back from the creek, and he sank the fence posts along the eastern boundary with a level and a patience I have tried, with mixed success, to inherit. I remember watching him reset a corner post one summer morning when I was 8 years old, the smell of turned earth and cedar around us, his hands moving with the economy of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times. He told me that morning that a fence post done right would outlast the man who set it. He was correct. Several of his posts are still standing. My name is David Crandall. I am 62 years old. I spent 30 years as a structural engineer before retiring to manage the property full-time, and that professional background shaped the way I think about land, as a system of documented relationships between boundaries, instruments, and recorded claims, each one either supported by the public record or it is not. My father, Raymond Crandall, ran the property after Earl died in 1979. And when Raymond passed in 2004, the deed transferred to me through a testamentary instrument that had been sitting in a manila envelope in the top drawer of his desk for 11 years. I drove to the county recorder's office myself and filed the transfer within the week. The deed was recorded. The land was mine. All of it, including the access road that ran along the western edge of the creek bottom and connected the ridge properties above to the county highway below. That road is the detail that matters here, so I want to be precise about it. When the Harlan County Planning Commission approved the Ridgeline Estates development in 1997, the developer, a company called Crestwood Properties, needed a recorded access route to connect the new subdivision to the county highway. The only viable corridor was the existing farm road crossing the southwestern corner of my father's land. My father negotiated the easement himself. He was not a lawyer, but he was methodical, and he insisted on language the developer's attorney eventually agreed to. The easement was granted for ingress and egress by the residents of Ridgeline Estates, appurtenant to the lots as platted, with maintenance responsibility assigned to whoever held the easement interest. The underlying fee title to the road and the land beneath it remained with the Crandall family. Always. That was not ambiguous language. It was recorded in Harlan County Deed Book 214, pages 88 through 91, on the 19th of November, 1997, and it had been sitting in the public record ever since, available to anyone who cared to look. The Ridgeline Estates HOA was formed in 1999, 2 years after the easement was recorded. Crestwood Properties transferred the easement maintenance obligation to the HOA as part of the standard turnover package when the developer exited the project. What Crestwood did not transfer, because it was not Crestwood's to transfer, was any ownership interest in the road itself. The HOA received the right to use the road and the obligation to maintain it, nothing more. That distinction between the right to use a thing and the right to own it is the entire story. The woman with the clipboard was named Patricia Holloway. She was the HOA's compliance director, a position the board had created 2 years earlier and filled with someone who had, as near as I could tell, no background in property law and a considerable appetite for the authority the title implied. I had seen her at County Planning Commission meetings, where she spoke in the confident cadence of someone reading from a script she had written herself. She was not unintelligent. She was simply operating from assumptions that had never been tested against the actual record. The notice she handed me that morning cited 3 violations. The first was that I had installed a drainage pipe along the western edge of the access road without HOA approval. The second was that I had placed a gate at the southern end of the road without authorization. The third was a general claim that I was interfering with HOA-managed infrastructure by conducting maintenance activities on the road corridor without board consent. The fine was $450, due within 14 days. The notice cited the HOA's community standards document and referenced, in general terms, the recorded easement. It did not cite the specific deed book and page numbers. It did not quote the language of the easement instrument. It did not acknowledge that the underlying fee title to the road belonged to anyone other than the HOA's implied dominion over the corridor. I read the notice twice, standing in the gravel drive while the morning warmed around me. A red-tailed hawk was working the thermals above the creek bottom, tilting and banking without apparent effort. I folded the notice along its original crease and put it in my jacket pocket. "Thank you for coming out," I said. Patricia Holloway looked at me as if she had expected more. Then she said the road corridor was an HOA asset, and any modifications required board approval, and that if I had questions, I could attend the next board meeting. She said it pleasantly enough, but there was something underneath the pleasantness, a mild impatience, the tone of someone explaining something to a person being unnecessarily slow. I told her I appreciated the information. She got back in her vehicle, a clean white SUV with the HOA logo on the door panel, and drove back up the road. I watched her go. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt, standing there in the gravel with the hawk still working the thermals overhead, was something closer to interest. A problem had presented itself. Problems, in my experience, are best approached with a survey and a set of documents, not with emotion. The first thing I did was pull the original easement instrument from my files. I kept the property documents in a gray steel cabinet in the back room of the house: deed, survey plats, tax records, the easement instrument, correspondence going back to my father's time, organized by date and cross-referenced by instrument number. The easement document was exactly where it had always been, in a folder labeled Western Road Corridor, Recorded Instruments, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, but the text perfectly legible. I read it the way I read structural specifications, from the beginning checking each clause against the requirement it was supposed to satisfy. Section 3 of the easement instrument was the operative provision. It read, in the language my father's attorney had insisted upon, that the easement was granted as a non-exclusive right of ingress and egress over the described corridor, that the fee simple title to the corridor remained vested in the grantor and the grantor's heirs and assigns, and that nothing in the instrument should be construed to convey any ownership interest in the underlying land to the grantee or any successor in interest. The maintenance obligation in Section 5 was explicit. The grantee, and by assignment, the HOA, was responsible for keeping the road surface in a condition suitable for ordinary vehicle passage, but that obligation did not extend to any right to modify, improve, or restrict the corridor without the written consent of the fee title holder. I had installed the drainage pipe because the original culvert had failed and the road was beginning to erode. I had installed the gate because the county required one at the highway junction for liability reasons, and because I had the right to do so as the fee title holder. Neither action required HOA approval. The HOA's compliance notice had the situation precisely backwards. I set the easement document on the kitchen table next to the compliance notice and looked at them side by side for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone and called Thomas Abernathy. Thomas had been practicing property law in Harlan County for 34 years. He was the kind of attorney who kept physical files on every matter he had ever touched, who knew the county recorder's staff by name, and who had a habit of reading instruments aloud to himself in a low murmur when working through a question. My father had used him for the original easement negotiation, and I had used him twice since for routine title matters. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David, send me the notice and the easement instrument. I'll pull the plat and the deed book entries and call you back." He called back the following afternoon. His voice had the particular flatness it took on when he had found something that confirmed what he already suspected. He said the HOA's compliance notice had no legal foundation. The drainage pipe and the gate were both within my rights as fee title holder. The HOA's claim that the road corridor was an HOA asset was flatly contradicted by the recorded easement instrument, which any title search would have surfaced in the first 10 minutes. He said he would draft a response letter and send it certified mail to the HOA board, citing the specific deed book references and the operative language of Section 3. "Do you want to resolve this quietly?" he said, "or do you want to resolve it completely?" I told him I wanted to resolve it correctly. The certified letter went out the following week. Thomas had written it in the measured, precise language of someone who has spent 3 decades making arguments in county courtrooms. No heat, no accusation. Simply a clause-by-clause accounting of the legal position, with the deed book citation set out in full and the operative language of the easement instrument quoted verbatim. He noted that the HOA's compliance notice appeared to assert ownership or administrative authority over a road corridor in which the HOA held only an easement interest, and that any further action premised on that assertion would be without legal foundation and potentially actionable. The HOA board received the letter on a Tuesday. I know this because Thomas sent it with return receipt requested, and the green card came back signed by Patricia Holloway herself. I put it in the folder with the compliance notice and the easement instrument and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was a second letter. It arrived 3 weeks later on HOA letterhead, signed by the board president, a man named Gerald Fitch, who ran a small insurance agency in town and had been on the board for 6 years. The letter acknowledged in careful language that the HOA held an easement interest rather than fee title to the road corridor. It then argued, on the basis of a clause in the HOA's community standards document, that the board had authority to regulate any infrastructure serving the Ridgeline Estates community, and that the access road, as the primary ingress and egress route for all residents, fell within that regulatory authority regardless of the underlying fee ownership. I read that argument twice, then I read the community standards clause they cited. The clause read, in its entirety, that the board was authorized to regulate the maintenance and use of common areas and shared infrastructure within the Ridgeline Estates development. The road corridor was not within the Ridgeline Estates development. It was on my land, outside the platted subdivision boundary, connected to the development by the recorded easement and nothing else. The community standards document had no authority over land that was not part of the development. The board had cited a clause that did not reach the thing they were trying to regulate. I forwarded the letter to Thomas with a 1-line note. They tried again. He called me the same afternoon. "They've narrowed their position," he said, "but they haven't improved it. The community standards document is a private governance instrument. It has no authority over your land. I think they're hoping you'll accept a negotiated arrangement rather than press the legal question." He paused. "The question is whether you want to press it." I told him I wanted to wait and see what the road did next. "What do you mean, what the road does next?" "There's a storm system coming in from the southwest," I said. "The forecast is showing significant rainfall over the next week. The road corridor has a drainage problem at the northern end. The culvert I installed was addressing it, but the HOA's position is that I installed it without authorization. If their position is that the maintenance obligation is theirs and not mine, then the drainage problem is theirs to solve. Thomas was quiet for a moment. David, if you have a maintenance obligation under the easement instrument, you need to honor it. I told him to look at Section 5 again. He did. He called back an hour later. Section 5 assigns the maintenance obligation to the grantee, he said. That's the HOA. Another pause. Well, that's interesting. The storm arrived 4 days later, and I watched it come in from the ridge. It came the way serious weather always comes into that valley, not as a sudden event, but as a slow darkening of the western ridge, the air thickening with the smell of wet limestone and creek-bottom mud, the mallards on the lower pond moving to the cattail edge the way they always did before rain, as if they had been reading that sky since before my grandfather's time. I stood on the back porch and watched the front build for the better part of an hour, a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, thinking about water and grade and the particular physics of what happens to an unpaved road surface when rainfall exceeds the drainage capacity of its corridor. The northern end of the access road ran through a low section where the creek bottom pinched against the ridge. My grandfather had understood that drainage problem when he first built the farm road, and he had addressed it with a simple cross drain that moved surface water off the road before it could pool and undercut the roadbed. That original cross drain had been replaced twice in my father's time and once in mine, and the most recent replacement, the corrugated steel culvert I had installed 18 months earlier, was the one Patricia Holloway's compliance notice had cited as an unauthorized modification. My position, as supported by Section 5 of the easement instrument, was that the maintenance obligation, including drainage maintenance, belonged to the HOA. I had not removed the culvert. I want to be precise about that. I had installed it and left it in place, because removing it would have been irresponsible. But at Thomas Abernethy's suggestion, I had sent a written notice to the HOA board 2 weeks before the storm arrived, informing them that the drainage infrastructure at the northern section required inspection and that, as the party holding the maintenance obligation under Section 5 of the recorded easement, the board should arrange for that inspection at their earliest convenience. The letter cited the deed book and page number, the specific language of Section 5, and was sent certified mail, return receipt requested. The green card came back signed by Gerald Fitch on a Thursday morning. The board did not arrange for an inspection. The storm dropped 4.5 inches of rain in 36 hours. I know that figure precisely because I have kept a rain gauge at the property for 20 years and record the readings in a log going back to 2003. The gauge read 4.6 inches when I checked it the morning after the front passed, and the creek was running high and brown and fast. I put on my boots and walked the road corridor from the county highway junction to the subdivision entrance, roughly 400 yards, taking photographs at regular intervals with a timestamp-enabled camera. I had been doing this since the compliance notice arrived. A weekly photographic survey of the corridor, documented and dated, filed in the gray steel cabinet alongside everything else. What I found at the northern section was significant. The road surface had eroded badly at the low point, the gravel washed to the downhill side, and the underlying clay subgrade exposed and rutted. The culvert was functioning correctly, but the storm volume had exceeded what any single culvert could manage, and the overflow had channeled across the road surface for approximately 60 feet. The roadbed was passable, but barely, and only in a high-clearance vehicle traveling slowly. It needed grading and fresh gravel promptly before the next rain event consolidated the ruts. I documented everything. Photographs from 6 angles, tape-measured dimensions, field notes with timestamps. The rut at its deepest point measured 4 3/4 inches. Then I walked back to the house and called Thomas. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "And the board has the maintenance obligation in writing. Certified mail received." I told him that was correct. and they did not inspect or repair prior to the storm. I told him that was also correct. "David," he said, his voice taking on the careful flatness again, "send me those photographs today. I'm going to prepare a second letter to the board, and this one is going to be somewhat more direct about the consequences of failing to honor a recorded maintenance obligation." The second letter from Thomas went out within the week. It noted that the HOA board had received written notice of a drainage deficiency, that the notice had cited the board's maintenance obligation under the recorded easement instrument, that the board had taken no remedial action, and that the resulting storm damage had rendered the corridor partially impassable. It invited the board to address the maintenance deficiency within 30 days and to clarify, in writing, whether they intended to honor the maintenance obligation assigned to them under the recorded instrument, or whether they intended to disclaim it. It noted, with precision, that disclaiming the obligation would have consequences for the board's authority claims under the Community Standards document, since an entity that disclaimed a recorded obligation could not simultaneously assert authority derived from the same recorded instrument. The HOA could not have it both ways. They could not assert regulatory authority over the road corridor on the basis of the easement instrument while simultaneously disclaiming the maintenance obligation that the same instrument imposed on them. The letter planted that contradiction in the record, clearly and without heat, and left the board to decide what to do with it. My neighbor, Warren Gill, called me the evening after the board received Thomas's second letter. Warren had owned the 40-acre parcel adjacent to my eastern boundary for 22 years, and he attended HOA meetings occasionally, not because he was a member, but because the meetings were public and Warren had a quiet, methodical interest in what the board was doing. He told me that Gerald Fitch had read Thomas's letter aloud at an emergency board session and that Patricia Holloway had responded by saying the board should refer it to their attorney. The board had voted 4-1 to do exactly that. The one dissenting vote had been cast by a board member named Carl Odom, who said, quietly and without elaboration, that the board should probably read Section 5 of the easement instrument before they paid an attorney to read it for them. I thanked Warren for the information. He said, before he hung up, "David, they don't know what they're sitting in." I told him I thought that was probably right. The board's attorney was a general practice lawyer from the county seat named Brenda Marsh, who handled mostly residential closings and estate matters. She was not a property litigation specialist, but she was competent, and when she pulled Harlan County Deed Book 214, pages 88 through 91, and read the easement instrument in full, she apparently understood what she was reading. The letter she sent to Thomas 3 weeks later had a different quality than anything the board had produced on its own, measured, careful, notably free of regulatory confidence. It acknowledged the easement instrument's maintenance language. It acknowledged that the board had received written notice of the drainage deficiency prior to the storm. It did not concede liability, but it did not assert authority either. It asked whether the parties could arrange a meeting to discuss the road corridor's condition and the respective obligations of each party under the recorded instrument. Thomas called me after he received it. "She read the deed," he said. "She read all of it." I told him I thought that was a reasonable development. "It is," he said. "It also means they now know that the compliance notice and both board letters were built on a misreading of the instrument. That's a significant internal problem for the board." He paused. "I think we should agree to the meeting." I agreed to the meeting. But before I confirmed the date, I asked Thomas one additional question, and the answer changed the nature of everything that followed. I asked him to pull the original Plat map for the Ridgeline Estates subdivision, not the easement instrument, but the Plat itself, the recorded survey that established the lot boundaries and the subdivision's legal footprint. I had been thinking about something Warren had said, about the board not knowing what they were sitting in, and I wanted to verify a detail that had been in the back of my mind since I first read Gerald Fitch's letter. Thomas pulled the Plat the following morning. He called me at 9:30, and his voice had the particular quality it took on when something in the record had surprised him, which was not often. He said, "David, I need you to come to the office." I drove to town that afternoon. Thomas had the Plat map spread on the conference table, weighted at the corners with thick statute books, and he had drawn the road corridor boundary in red marker on a photocopy of the survey. He pointed to the southern end of the access road, the end that met the county highway where I had installed the gate Patricia Holloway's compliance notice had cited. Then he pointed to a line on the Plat approximately 60 yards north of the highway junction. "This is the southern boundary of the Ridgeline Estates subdivision," he said. "As platted and recorded in Harlan County Plat Book 31, page 44, the subdivision begins here." He moved his finger south toward the highway. "Everything below this line, the southern 60 yards of the road corridor, the gate, the highway junction, the culvert approach, is not within the platted subdivision. It is on your land, outside the subdivision boundary, with no connection to the Ridgeline Estates plat except through the easement instrument." I looked at the map for a long moment. My grandfather had built that road along the natural grade of the creek bottom, following the path of least resistance the way good engineers always do, and the line he had chosen was the line the developer had used when they platted the easement corridor in 1997. The road had been mine before the subdivision existed. The road was mine still. "The HOA's Community Standards document," I said, "claims authority over infrastructure serving the Ridgeline Estates community." "It does," Thomas said. "The Ridgeline Estates community begins 60 yards north of the highway junction." "Correct." "So the gate, the culvert, and the southern approach, the specific items cited in Patricia Holloway's compliance notice, are outside the geographic scope of the Community Standards document entirely." Thomas looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Every single one," he said. The compliance notice had not merely misread the easement instrument. It had cited a governance document that had no jurisdiction over the land it was purporting to regulate. The HOA's Community Standards document applied within the platted boundaries of Ridgeline Estates. The items Patricia Holloway had cited were outside those boundaries. The board had issued a fine and threatened further action on the basis of a document that did not reach the property it was describing. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window of Thomas's office, the main street of the county seat was going about its ordinary business. A feed truck idling at the light. A woman walking a dog past the hardware store. The particular unhurried quality of a small Tennessee town on a weekday afternoon. The Plat map lay on the table between us, the red lines Thomas had drawn as clear and unambiguous as anything I had seen in 30 years of reading structural drawings. "So when Patricia Holloway handed me that notice," I said, "she was standing on my land, citing a document that didn't apply to my land, about structures that were outside the document's geographic scope." Thomas nodded once. "That is an accurate summary of the record. I thought about my grandfather sinking fence posts in the dark creek bottom soil, level and patient, building something that would outlast him. I thought about my father sitting across the table from a developer's attorney in 1997, insisting on language precise enough to mean what it said. I thought about the gray steel cabinet in the back room of my house, and the folder labeled Western Road Corridor, Recorded Instruments, and the fact that the answer had been sitting in the public record for 27 years, available to anyone who cared to look. The record had not changed. It had simply been waiting. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning at the Harlan County Courthouse Annex, a low brick building 2 blocks off the main square that housed the County Planning Commission, and a pair of small conference rooms that smelled of old carpet and recycled air. Thomas had arranged it as a structured mediation session rather than a formal hearing, which meant there was no judge present, but there was a county mediator, a retired circuit court clerk named Harold Spivey, who had spent 30 years watching property disputes resolve themselves into the same half-dozen recurring patterns. Harold had a yellow legal pad and a habit of writing things down in a small, precise hand without looking up from the page, and he had the particular patience of someone who had learned that silence, applied at the right moment, was more productive than any question. The HOA was represented by Brenda Marsh and by Gerald Fitch, who arrived in a pressed sport coat and carried a manila folder he set on the table with the care of someone who wanted it to look substantial. Patricia Holloway was there as well. She sat to Gerald Fitch's left with a legal pad she did not use, and she looked for the first time since I had known of her like someone who had been briefed on something she would have preferred not to know. Brenda Marsh had clearly done her job. The rehearsed confidence that had been in Patricia Holloway's voice on my gravel drive that first morning was not in the room. Thomas opened by placing 3 documents on the table: the recorded easement instrument from Deed Book 214, the Ridgeline Estates Plat from Plat Book 31, and the compliance notice Patricia Holloway had delivered to my property in March. He did not argue from them immediately. He simply placed them in parallel, the way you place structural drawings next to a field condition to let the comparison speak for itself, and he asked Harold Spivey to note that all 3 were entered as exhibits. Then he walked through the record. He did it slowly and without drama, citing the deed book page numbers as he went, reading the operative language of Section 3 and Section 5 aloud in the low, precise murmur I recognized from our phone calls. He noted the Plat boundary. He noted the 60-yard gap between the southern limit of the Ridgeline Estates subdivision and the highway junction where the gate stood. He noted that the 3 specific items cited in the compliance notice were all located either on land outside the platted subdivision boundary or within the scope of the HOA's own recorded maintenance obligation, or both. Brenda Marsh did not argue with any of it. She acknowledged the easement instrument's language. She acknowledged the Plat boundary. She said carefully that the board had acted on an understanding of the road corridor's governance that the recorded instruments did not fully support, and that the board was prepared to withdraw the compliance notice and vacate the associated fine. Gerald Fitch looked at the table when she said that. Patricia Holloway wrote something on her legal pad that I could not read from across the table. Harold Spivey wrote something on his own pad. Then he looked up and asked whether the parties were prepared to stipulate to the withdrawal in writing, with the stipulation entered into the county's mediation record. Brenda Marsh said they were. Thomas said we were. Harold wrote for another 30 seconds in his small, precise hand. The recycled air moved through the ceiling vent. Outside the window, a mockingbird was working through its catalog in a parking lot oak, cycling through borrowed calls with the patient industry of a creature that understood imitation as a form of authority. The compliance notice was vacated. The fine was withdrawn. The board stipulated, in writing entered into the county record, that the road corridor from the county highway to the southern boundary of the Ridgeline Estates Plat was the fee simple property of the Crandall family, that the HOA held only an easement interest in the corridor, and that the HOA's maintenance obligation under Section 5 of the recorded instrument remained in full effect. The stipulation was signed by Gerald Fitch on behalf of the board and by Brenda Marsh's counsel, and it was entered into the record on a Thursday morning in a room that smelled of old carpet by a retired circuit court clerk who had seen the same half-dozen patterns resolve themselves 30 years running. I signed my copy. Thomas signed as my counsel. I folded it along a clean crease and put it in my jacket pocket, next to where the compliance notice had been on the morning Patricia Holloway had handed it to me on my gravel drive. I thanked Harold Spivey for his time. I thanked Brenda Marsh for her professionalism. I did not say anything to Patricia Holloway or to Gerald Fitch because there was nothing that needed to be said. The record had said it. We were out of the building by 11 o'clock. 3 days after the mediation, a second storm system moved through the valley. It was not as large as the first. The gauge read 2.1 inches over 18 hours. But it came on top of soil already saturated from the earlier event, and the creek ran high again, and the northern section of the access road, which the HOA had still not graded or repaired, took on additional damage. The ruts that had been 4 3/4 inches deep after the first storm were now closer to 7. A section of roadbed approximately 20 feet long had developed a washout where the subgrade clay had given way entirely, leaving a depression that no standard passenger vehicle could cross without grounding its frame on the exposed lip of hardpan. I walked the corridor the morning after the storm and documented it as before. Photographs, measurements, field notes, timestamps. The washout at the northern section was significant enough that I noted it separately in the field log, a transverse erosion feature approximately 20 feet in length and 8 inches deep at its lowest point, rendering the corridor impassable to standard passenger vehicles. I filed the documentation in the gray steel cabinet. I did not call the HOA. The maintenance obligation was theirs, in writing, entered into the county record 3 days prior. What happened next was not my responsibility to manage. What happened next, I learned from Warren Gill. He called me on a Saturday afternoon with the particular tone he used when he had witnessed something he thought I should know about. He had been working his fence line along the eastern boundary that morning, replacing a corner post that had heaved over the winter, and from his position he had a clear view of the lower section of the access road. He said Patricia Holloway had come down from the subdivision in her white HOA vehicle at around 9 in the morning. She had come down the road the way she always did, because it was the only paved route from Ridgeline Estates to the county highway. There was a secondary gravel track along the ridge to the east, but it crossed a different landowner's property entirely and required that landowner's permission to use permission that had never been formally granted and could not be assumed. For practical purposes, the road through my land was the only way in and the only way out. She had reached the washout and stopped. Warren said she sat in the vehicle for a few minutes, then got out and stood at the edge of the depression, looking at it. The washout was 8 inches deep across 20 feet of roadbed, the far lip a ragged shelf of exposed clay, the bottom still wet from the storm. She had gotten back in the SUV and tried to ease forward, and the front wheels had dropped into the depression, and the frame had settled with a sound Warren described as a low, definitive thud. She had backed out carefully, pulled to the side, and sat with the engine running. Then she had gotten out again and walked to the edge of the washout and stood there with her phone in her hand. Warren said she made several calls. He could not hear the conversations from 200 yards, but he could see her posture. The way she turned once toward the subdivision entrance above her, then once toward the county highway below, then back to the washout, the phone still at her ear. She was measuring the problem the way people measure problems when the arithmetic is not working in their favor. The county highway was perhaps 300 yards to the south, visible from where she stood, close enough that she could have walked it in 5 minutes. But her vehicle was on the wrong side of the washout, and the washout was on land that belonged to me, and the maintenance obligation for the road surface was hers, entered into the county record in Harold Spivey's small, precise hand 3 days earlier, and none of that was going to change before the ground dried and a crew with a grader and a load of compacted gravel came out to address it. She stood at the edge of that washout for the better part of 45 minutes. I was not there to see it. I want to be clear about that, because the image Warren described, Patricia Holloway in her blazer standing at the lip of an 8-inch erosion feature on a road her organization had claimed authority over for months, phone in hand, the county highway visible and unreachable below her, her white HOA vehicle sitting at an angle on the wrong side of the depression, is not an image I arranged. I had not removed the culvert. I had not diverted the drainage. I had not caused the storm or chosen the grade of the creek bottom or decided where the subgrade clay would give way. I had simply documented the condition, honored the legal record, and stepped back. The storm had done the rest. What she was standing in that moment, was the arithmetic of her own organization's choices. The road through my land was the only road she had. It had always been the only road she had, in every practical sense that mattered on a Saturday morning when she needed to reach the county highway and her vehicle was sitting in a rut on the wrong side of a washout. The HOA had received written notice of the drainage deficiency before the first storm. They had taken no action. They had stipulated in a county record signed 3 days earlier that the maintenance obligation was theirs. The road had washed out because it had not been maintained. And it had not been maintained because the party responsible for maintaining it had spent 8 months arguing about authority instead of reading the instrument that defined it. She had driven down that same road in March with a clipboard and a rehearsed delivery, stood on my land, and told me I had 14 days to comply. She had not known the road beneath her tires was mine. She had not known the document she was citing did not reach the land she was standing on. She had not known the maintenance obligation she was trying to assign to me was, by the plain language of the recorded instrument, hers. She had performed institutional authority with considerable confidence, and the record had been waiting quietly the entire time. Now she was standing at the edge of what that confidence had produced, on land she did not own, looking at a road she had not maintained, with no way forward and no way around, the county highway 300 yards away and completely out of reach. Warren said she eventually walked back up the road toward the subdivision on foot, leaving the SUV where it was. He watched her go until she rounded the curve at the upper section and disappeared into the tree line. He did not see her return that day. I thanked Warren for the report. He said before he hung up, "David, I don't think she knew." I told him I thought that was probably right. I told him I thought that was the whole story, in 4 words. The HOA arranged the repair eventually, after 2 more certified letters from Thomas and a formal demand citing the mediation stipulation by instrument number and date. The work was done in late spring, when the ground had dried enough to support the equipment and the road was restored to a condition suitable for ordinary vehicle passage, which is the language Section 5 uses, and which is exactly what it means. Patricia Holloway's white SUV was retrieved sometime before then. I did not ask about the particulars. It was not my vehicle, and it was not my road to manage. The compliance notice was gone from the record. The fine was gone. The stipulation was in. The road was repaired by the party responsible for repairing it, on the schedule that the obligation and the weather and the county record had together produced. I walked the corridor one last time on an evening in early June, when the light was long and the creek was running clear and low, the water moving over the limestone shelf at the bottom of the grade with the same sound it had made every June of my life. The mallards were back on the lower pond, a pair of them working the shallows near the cattail edge, unhurried, reading the water the way they always had. The fence posts along the eastern boundary stood where my grandfather had set them, or where his posts had been replaced by my father's, or where my father's had been replaced by mine, the line continuous, the boundary documented, the land exactly what the deed said it was. I stopped at the northern section, where the repaired roadbed was still visible as a slightly lighter band of fresh gravel across the old surface. The washout was gone. The grade was clean. You would not have known, walking it that evening, that anything had happened there, but I knew the measurements. 4 3/4 inches after the first storm, 8 inches after the second, 20 feet of exposed hardpan, and a white SUV sitting at an angle on the uphill side, and Patricia Holloway standing at the edge of it with her phone in her hand, looking at the county highway she could see but could not reach, on land she had spent 8 months trying to govern and had never owned for a single day. The lesson I took from all of it was not complicated, and it was not new. When an institution with apparent authority makes a claim against you, a notice, a fine, a demand, a letter on official letterhead with a title beneath the signature, the first question is not whether the institution seems powerful, or whether the person delivering the claim seems confident, or whether the document looks official. The first question is whether the claim has a legal foundation. And the answer to that question is always in the record, not in the letterhead, not in the blazer, not in the clipboard or the laminated sheet or the rehearsed delivery, in the record, in the deed book and the plat map and the easement instrument and the county recorder's files where the truth has been sitting, available to anyone who cared to look since the day it was filed. My grandfather understood that. He built his fence posts to last longer than the man who set them. He was right about that too. The creek ran on. The mallards did not look up. The evening light moved across the ridge in the slow, unhurried way it always had, and the land was exactly what it had always been, documented, bounded, and mine. If any of this sounds familiar, a boundary dispute, a notice that didn't hold up, a deed that told a different story than the person standing on your land, leave it in the comments. These cases are more common than people think, and the details matter. If you want to hear the next one, the channel is here, and so am I.